Today I'm doing corn chowder, and it's a really tasty soup that many of you have probably had, and it's really easy to make. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. I've got 2 tablespoons of some kind of vegetable oil that can take heat. So I'm using canola oil. You could use other types of vegetable oil as well. Really fine olive oils may not be the best choice here because they have a little bit different smoke point, but peanut oil would work. So there's lots of choices. Not quite as hot as I'd like, but I'm going to go ahead and put it in. I've got 1/4 of a cup of chopped onion. Now I've chopped this pretty fine because it is going to be a soup and I don't want to feel those big chunks of onion in there. But this is personal preference as to exactly how fine you want it to go. I'm going to get this a little hotter. We're going to let that cook until it starts to be translucent, starts to turn golden. We don't want it to actually go any farther than that. So we'll give that a minute to kind of catch up with me, and I'll go ahead and talk about some of these other things. We are using canned corn in this, or canned creamed corn. And notice that there's an ED at the end of creamed. I've discovered that a lot of people are unaware that there is no fat added when we make creamed corn. It is in fact the corn itself. A lot of times when it's commercially canned, there's a little bit of sugar added to it. There may be a little bit of salt added to it, but it's pretty much corn. And there's also, when it's commercially done, there's also a little bit of thickening that is often put in there to give it a thicker feel. It's not quite a soup. Some of them are more soupy than others, so that you may try out different brands and find one that you like better. If you do it yourself, that thickening is going to come when you take the corn off the cob. You'll actually scrape down the cob several times to get all the juice out of there, and inside that juice is also a fair amount of starch, and so that's going to thicken it up as it goes as well. I think we're going to progress, even though the onion's not quite where we'd like it to be. I've got a little over a cup of potatoes, somewhere around there. I came out a little bit more than a cup when I did 2 potatoes, so I just went ahead and went with that. We're going to add those to this, to our onions that are cooking. It's going to continue to cook, so we will get the cooked flavor of those onions over time. They're chopped, and the amount of chop is, again, up to you. The type of potato that you use, I probably would recommend that you use whatever kind you have, but I can give you a little bit of information about the different kinds as to help you decide which kind you may want to have in your pantry. The red potatoes are going to give it a waxy feel. They're going to hold their shape, so the potatoes are going to stay in the cube that you cut them into as this goes along. If you use a russet potato, a baking potato, they're going to soften up more and start to fall apart. So it's a little bit what you want to have happen. As they start to fall apart, one of the things you'll see happening is also that some of that starch is coming out. You may get a little bit more thickening out of that. Since I've got the potatoes in here, I'm also going to add 1.5 cups of water. Start with boiling water if you can. This water was boiling at one point, but we've taken a few minutes to get here, so it's still very hot. But that's just going to bring it back up to heat quicker. We want this to come to a boil, then you can reduce the heat and let it simmer until the potatoes are tender. And that's going to depend a little bit on how big of chunks you cut them into and what kind of potato you have. It's usually going to be somewhere between 10 to 15 minutes. So we'll go ahead with that. I'm going to go ahead and put the lid on this to let it cook a little bit quicker. Remember, you're working with potatoes though, so if you're using a little bit smaller pan, you want to make sure they're not going to boil over. So I'm going to leave it just ajar, keep the heat in, but let the steam out. We'll be right back after this is boiled and those potatoes are gone. Our potatoes have gotten tender. I've just been pushing them up against the side a little bit here, and you can see that they're nice and soft now. So I'm ready to add them on. I don't like, and you may, again, this is personal preference, but I like them to be well cooked for this kind of an activity here. All right, I've got 1 can, which is, 15 ounces probably now, of creamed corn. And if you're buying it commercially, you can find a few brands with no sodium added or no salt added. So if you have that as a concern, you may want to do that. And I did that, but I'm going to go ahead and add salt to it. So I have control over the amount of salt rather than not. You may want to add less salt if you didn't get one that doesn't have any added to it. I'm going to add 1/2 teaspoon of coarse salt or kosher salt to this. Remember that when you use kosher salt, you're using half as much. So if you don't have kosher, go ahead and add some, but only add 1/4 teaspoon. I'm also going to add 1/4 teaspoon of black pepper. and 1/8 of a teaspoon of paprika. Now I'm using a smoky paprika. I think it adds a lot more flavor than the regular kind, but you could use regular or you could experiment with other kinds of flavorings in this as well. And we're going to let that come back to a quick boil. I'm going to add also 1 cup of, I'm using 2% milk. I wanted to cut back on the amount of milk, or the amount of fat, but we do want it to be really creamy. So I'm going to head with a 2%. One of the things you have to watch with milk whenever you cook it is that there are proteins in here that are going to sink to the bottom. And the casein is also going to be involved in this. So it's going to be proteins and casein, and they're going to cause problems at the bottom of the pan and at the top of the pan. So you're going to want to be very careful and keep an eye on it. What happens at the top of the pan is that the water evaporates, those proteins and caseins come together, and you get that skim on the top like you do with cocoa, and that lets the pressure build up underneath, and that's going to raise the whole thing, and then you get it coming out the top. So you're going to watch carefully for that. One of the things you could do with cocoa, for instance, would be to use a whisk and get a little bit of a foam going. Probably not going to work very well with this recipe, so one of the things you can do here is either keep a close eye on it, or you can cover it a little bit like we did when we were cooking the potatoes to keep that from boiling over. And that will keep some of that evaporation down and slow the speed of it, but eventually it's going to build up on you. So you're going to have to just keep coming back and checking on it from time to time. You also are going to worry about the proteins that are going to sink to the bottom because they're going to move together, they're going to stick down there, and then they're going to scorch. And that's why milk scorches so easily, because the proteins sink and stick. And once they have stuck, I know most of you have probably experienced a pan with scalded milk or burnt milk, scorched milk on the bottom, and it's never fun to clean up. So the best approach is to prevent it from happening in the first place. So stir it frequently, keep your eye on it. But while that's happening, I'm going to go on and get our thickener ready. We put 1 cup of milk in here already, and I reserved 1/2 of a cup out. And to that, I'm going to add a teaspoon of cornstarch. Now, you don't want to do this too early before your milk is going to be ready to add to the pot over here because it will start to thicken up, and whether you add it immediately before or you add it later, you're going to want to come back and stir it because sometimes it will sink, the cornstarch will sink in there. So once this is ready, we're going to crank the heat up just a little bit. I had it down pretty low. You don't want it much more than a medium. This does take a little bit of time, so it will require a slight amount of patience. One of the other things that may happen to your milk is that it may curdle, and other places where you see that happen will be with scalloped potatoes or creamed tomato soup. And that's because there are acids in all of the produce that you see. With the potatoes that we've got in here, we also have some phenols, and those are going to cause that milk to curdle out as well. So having the heat real high encourages that to happen. So if you cook scalloped potatoes in a 450-degree oven, for instance, you're much more apt to have that occur than if you cook it more like at a 350. Again, we're all Americans and we want things to move quickly, so we don't take as much time on some things as maybe we should. All right, we've got a little bit of boil around the edge. We don't need it to be boiling real fast. Just a little bit's going to do here. And I'm going to stir using a spoon that can go in the pot. Stir this slowly in. We're going to bring this again up to where it's just barely boiling, and then we're going to let it simmer about 2 minutes. And the purpose of that is to cook that starch. It also thickens it, of course, but we don't want to taste the starch. We want it to be nice and thick. So once you put that starch in, you need to keep stirring, but you're going to let it simmer for about 2 minutes. Okay, you can see it's gotten nice and creamy. You can always adjust the thickness if you don't think it's quite where you want it to be, but this looks great. There's a little bit of the potato in there. You've got the corn. It's going to make a great lunch or dinner. It's particularly a nice thing on a Sunday evening where you've already had a big meal. A little bit of parsley on the top or whatever other green vegetable you might have there. A little bit of cornbread on the side. I think you're going to like this. It's corn chowder. For Oklahoma Gardening, I'm Barbara Brown.